Hey students, welcome back to another life science lesson. Today we're in chapter 2 where we talk about the characteristics of living things. Specifically, we're going to be talking about lesson 3, the chemistry of living things. What we've talked about so far is what makes something alive. That was lesson 1. And what are the needs of those things? And that was lesson number 2. Now we're going to talk about the chemistry, was how the chemistry of those living things works to keep things not only alive, but thriving, and ability for it to do all those 5 things that are required of a living thing. A lot of that revolves around chemistry. Okay, so the chemistry of living things, we're going to talk first a little bit of some nomenclature, some vocabulary as it relates to chemistry. And we'll talk first about what's called an element. Okay, an element is a pure substance. That means it's all the same thing. Remember, a substance is it has all the same material throughout. So an element has all the same type of atoms in it, and it can't be broken down by physical or chemical ways. So here's a picture. This yellow right here is sulfur. This is all going to, it's called elemental sulfur. It's made of all sulfur, all the element F on the periodic table, and it is all sulfur. So if I were to smash this, it still would be sulfur. Okay, if I would heat it up, it still would be sulfur. Okay, so an element, it can't be broken down any farther. So there are 118 currently known elements in the universe, and sulfur is one of those. Okay. Now, a compound is going to be a pure substance, meaning that it's the same throughout, but it contains atoms of 2 or more elements. So, an example of that would be salt. Salt is a compound because it contains sodium and chlorine, and when you combine those together and they're bound together chemically, that's called sodium chloride or table salt. So each sodium chloride cube here, that's what salt looks like under a microscope or under a magnifying glass. It has equal amounts of sodium and chlorine in fixed positions, okay, in fixed proportions. For every 1 sodium, you have 1 chlorine in this position. Another one you can think of is H2O. That's water. For every 2 hydrogens, you have 1 oxygen. That is also a compound. Now, a molecule is going to consist of 2 or more atoms chemically tied together, and it's the smallest version of that. So a molecule would be 2 of the same type of bonded together. So oxygen here is a symbol O, bonds to itself to form O2, and that's the oxygen that you and I breathe. O2, it is oxygen bonded to itself. So it is more than one atom, okay, here, but it is bonded to itself, so it's called a molecule. H2, similar other molecules like chlorine gas is LCl2. Fluorine gas is F2. Okay, so that's the difference when we talk about elements, compounds, and molecules. What we'll be talking about, majority of this class will be compounds. Actually, for the rest of our time in this lesson is going to be talking about compounds where there's more than one type of atom, like sodium chloride. So here, there are elements, though, that are in the human body that make the human body go. Okay. And so most of your body is made up of, composed of oxygen. Now, this is just a little chart that shows you the percentage. It doesn't mean that all the oxygen is in your lower half and carbon is in your middle and hydrogen is in your shoulders and your throat is made of nitrogen and your all the others sit up in your brain. This is just kind of representing the percentage of your body. Oxygen is distributed through your body, carbon is distributed through your body, so is a hydrogen. Okay, so by percentage of your whole body, okay, 65% of your body is elemental oxygen, 18% is carbon, 10% is hydrogen, 3% is nitrogen, and the others. Now, your book that we're using, they have a little bit different numbers here, but in general, this is why I want you to see that the majority of your body is oxygen and carbon. If you add those two up, that's over 3/4 or 80%. Over 80% of your body is made up of 2 elements, carbon and hydrogen. Okay, so you have these elements that are in your body, and these other ones are called trace elements. So it talks about the others. Now, just because something is trace, meaning it's a very small amount, doesn't mean it's not important. Things like boron and chromium and fluorine, iodine, manganese, molybdenum. These are very important elements that actually help your body function. They just don't have a lot by percentage. They're still important though. So that's why when we talk about later, when we talk about the foods that you eat, you're going to want to make sure that there's parts of these in your food, and as well as sodium, potassium, phosphorus, and calcium. And all these others are important for your body to function. They're in larger amounts compared to the trace elements. The trace elements are still important for your body function. So let's talk about the different types of compounds that make up your body. Now, the compounds that are in your body will be made up of these types of elements here. So remember, elements are by themselves, and when they combine together with another type, so like C and O would make carbon dioxide or carbon monoxide, those are called compounds. So compounds are organic compounds. So that we're going to talk about the organic compounds, and anything that's considered an organic compound must contain carbon. So this coal right here, this ash from a fire contains carbon. This tree contains carbon, and this pencil, the tip of a pencil is not lead, it is graphite, which is also carbon. So all of these contain carbon, so these would be considered organic. Okay, the wood, the graphite, and the ash or the coal is all considered organic because it has carbon in it. Okay, so there are 5 different types of organic compounds we're going to learn about today. Okay, carbohydrates. Okay, carbohydrates, which could be considered sugar. Okay, lipids, called fats and oils. Proteins would be eggs and meats and beans and grains. Enzymes, these are these little enzymes, a special type of protein, has a special job. And then finally, a nucleic acid. We're going to learn about nucleic acids, which are another type of protein that has a specific job. So really, there are 3 types: carbohydrates, lipids, and proteins. And then there are 2 specialty types: enzymes and nucleic acids are types of proteins. So you can think of it that way. Okay, so carbohydrate is made from one or more sugar molecules. When you think of carbohydrate, you're thinking of sugar, not just the table sugar, the sweet stuff that you like, other types of sugars as well. Lipids, OC stands for organic compound, is an organic compound that usually is a fat or an oil. Proteins are made up of much smaller components called amino acids, and those amino acids make up the protein. So about 20 types of amino acids make up the proteins that we see in our body and in the world. Enzymes are special protein that speeds up a chemical reaction. I'll give you an example of that later. And then nucleic acids are the inorganic compound that do 2 things. They contain the genetic material that makes, when cells divide, that helps that cell become another cell. It gives it the instructions. It's the instructions that made your eyes blue or brown. It's the instructions that made your skin darker or lighter. That's what nucleic acids are. They're also used for building protein. They give information for proteins to build the right type of protein for the right type of purpose in an organism, particularly a human organism. All right, so let's talk about each one of these in turn. So carbohydrates, like I said, are sugars, and they're made from carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. So this is a compound that has 3 different elements combined, and the types would be sugar molecules would be a simple sugar and a complex carbohydrate. Simple and complex. Now, a simple is just a smaller molecule like table sugar that just has 1 or 2 sugar molecules linked together. So I want you to think of a train, and we have 2 cars that are linked together. Okay, so it's simple. So that is easier to break apart. 2 cars on the train are easier to break apart or to move, think of it that way, than a longer one. A complex one would be a molecule with a much longer sugar chains attached to one another. An example of that type of food would be starches like potatoes, bread, and rice. So when you think about in digestion, sugar, table sugar is used more quickly. It's broken down more quickly by your body and stored and used for energy than starches, which take longer to break down. You get longer energy. You can think of it out of those as well. Okay, so this is where that quote unquote sugar high comes from, even though it's not really true, but it gets burned quickly because it's simple. It's a little less complex than, say, something like a potato or bread or rice. Now, lipids, when you think of lipids, I want you to think about fats and oils. Fats and oils, okay? So, lipid is an organic compound that is made up of fat and oils, and they provide and store energy, and they make up most of the cells. The cell membranes are what are called phospholipid membranes. That's where the word lipid comes from. The surrounding part, the membrane that protects the cell or forms the cell, which we'll learn in our next unit, is made of a lipid, a fat. Okay, so some lipids are solid at room temperature. Butter is one of those. Crisco, or animal lard, is another example that they're considered a solid at room temperature. Okay, that is what's called a. I'll talk about that later. And then other types of lipids are liquid at room temperature. So I want you to think about oils. About oils, okay? So these contain lots of energy, okay? They can give us energy. We get a lot of energy from carbohydrates, are used immediately. Fats and oils are used for energy, but they're also used in a reserve supply. So if you have too much carbohydrates and too much fat in your diet, and you don't use that up through the activity of your day, that fat goes into storage. That lipid goes into storage, which is where fat comes from on a sea manatee or a whale, a bear, or if a human being is eating too much fat and carbohydrates and not exercising and living a lifestyle that they're just kind of sitting around most of the day, that goes into storage. So lipids can be stored for fat for later use. For later use, okay? The key is for a healthy lifestyle, you need to have that later use where you're actually being active enough where that fat is going to be used and pulled out of your storage system. Next is proteins. Proteins are organic compounds that are made up of smaller organic compounds called amino acids. They make up many structures of living things, such as our muscles, our fingernails, the antlers on this deer here, feathers on a bird. Okay, and so they help build and repair cells and tissues. So we can get that through a source like an egg or a bean or animal flesh or other types of grains as well. Even you can even get those from vegetables as well. Now, what proteins do, they also provide energy and carry important materials through the body. So, inside of a red blood cell, that's what this picture over here on the top left is. Inside that red blood cell is hemoglobin. And for example, hemoglobin is a protein in the red blood cell, in this little disc shaped red blood cell that carries oxygen. So, how oxygen gets to the various parts of your body, it's contained within the blood that's contained of red blood cells. And inside those red blood cells is a hemoglobin that is carrying the oxygen needed for your leg to move, or for your foot to tell you to jump up in the air, or for your eye to move like that. The oxygen that's required in those cells, the energy that's used in the ATP process, which we'll learn about in the next unit, is carried to that place in your body by a hemoglobin, which is along for the ride on a red blood cell. So proteins are very important. So we've talked about carbohydrates, that's quick energy, simple and complex. We've talked about lipids, which they make up most of our cells, or actually all of our cells, and they're used for energy, but go into storage if they're unused. And then proteins are important for building parts of our body. So I want you to think of proteins as the building blocks of your muscles and the building blocks of some of your tissues in your body. Now let's talk about the last two. These are special proteins. One's called an enzyme. Okay, this is an enzyme here, and there are special proteins that speed up chemical reactions in an organism or a cell. So I want you to think about if a chemical reaction needs to take place, but it's not happening fast enough, the enzyme kind of pushes it along. So I want you to think about a time you're on a team or you had a coach or you had a piano teacher or a dance teacher that was kind of pushing you to move faster or to practice more or run that play again or run that dance routine one more time. Now it's the person that pushes you along. It doesn't get involved in the dance or the soccer play or this piece of music you're playing. You're doing it, but they're encouraging, kind of pressing you to move forward and faster, right? Okay, that's what an enzyme does. It helps the reaction happen faster. So metabolism the fact that we might dissolve and break down the food that we eat. If we didn't have enzymes, it would take too long for us to metabolize, to break down food, for it to get into our bodies, to help us stay nutritious and help us to stay active and help us, our bodies, to work properly. So enzymes are given, they speed up a process that would take so slow that we would actually starve to death without enzymes. So enzymes are a lot like, they look like little Pac-Man. So here's a shape of an enzyme, and it attaches to what's called a substrate, and then it breaks that substrate apart. So I want you to think about, this is a chemical reaction here. The enzyme will attach itself to it, speed up that chemical reaction, and break it into smaller pieces. So imagine this is a piece of food that is broken down in your stomach or in your digestive system. So they're kind of shaped like Pac-Man over here, where they match up. So certain types of enzymes will match up to certain types of organic compounds. And so a certain enzyme will match, almost like a Lego block will slip in and break that apart. So sometimes they can thought of as Pac-Mans or Miss Pac-Mans, if you will. Okay. And the last one we're going to learn about is nucleic acids. Okay. Nucleic acids are organic compounds, and they contain genetic information and the information necessary for an organism to make a certain type of protein it needs. All right. So DNA is the information needed to build proteins that carry the genetic information on from one cell to the other, from one organism on to the other. And RNA is more like a message reader. Okay, a message reader. It reads the DNA, and so that the proteins can be built for specific purposes. All right, so these two types of nucleic acids are sometimes called the blueprint. A blueprint is the instructions for an organism, whether it be us, whether it be a dog, whether it be a squirrel, or whether it be a worm or a simple celled organism. DNA and RNA are used. Now, we're going to talk more specifically about DNA and RNA in our next unit, but I just want to introduce you to these 5 different organic compounds. So take a look at this chapter, read the assignment that I gave you that is on Google Classroom for you to review this and do the practice problem questions that I assigned you. So that's it for today, and I'll talk to you soon.